Good morning, everyone. This is the case of the people of the state of Colorado versus James Egan Holmes, case number 12 CR 1522. The record should reflect that Mr. Holmes is present with his attorneys and the prosecutors are present as well. And the attorneys on behalf of Mr. Holmes are Mr. King, Ms. Brady, Ms. Nelson, Ms. Higgs, and Ms. Spengler. On behalf of the people, we have Mr. Brockler, Mr. Orman, Ms. Pearson, Ms. Stitch McGuire, and Mr. Edson. I'm sorry for the delay. I needed more time to rule on D-TR-97, which is the video recording of the defendant at Denver Health Medical Center on November 19th of 2012. And that's a video recording that was completed by two defense investigators as they were questioning Mr. Holmes. I looked at it last night, but I wanted to think about it overnight. I know it's an important issue, and I thought of some things overnight, and I came in this morning and needed more time to look at some things and think about it further, and I've done that. And I'm rather than make a complete record at this time, what I propose is just telling you my ruling and then bringing the jury in so we don't make the jury wait. I have decided to sustain the objection to the exhibit, so the exhibit will not be admitted. Is everyone okay proceeding by having the jury come in and having me make a record later?
Yes, Your Honor.
Mr. King?
Yes, Judge.
Okay, let's do that. Let's bring the jury in, please. Thank you. Please be seated, everyone. The record should reflect that the jury is back in the courtroom. Good morning, everyone. How's everyone doing? Good. Thank you for your patience this morning. I appreciate that. At the end of the day yesterday, Mr. Brockler was in the middle of his cross-examination of Dr. Gurr. Dr. Gurr, I remind you that you're still under oath. And Mr. Brockler, you may resume your cross-examination of Dr. Gurr.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, Doctor.
Good morning.
Where we left off yesterday at about 5 o'clock was with the decision to wait 23 months to have a conversation between you and the parents about their son. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Now, one of the things that I wanted to follow up on and ask you is, I understand that your calendar and their calendar, for whatever reason, didn't match up for nearly 2 years. Why not pick up the phone and call them?
Several reasons.
Okay.
The first is that I discussed with the defense team information that relates to early development beyond the records that will be important for me to evaluate, and provided them with questions and topics such as major developmental milestone, when did he walk, when did he talk, early relationships with friends in lower school, relationship within the family, and members of the defense team. The investigator went out in January of 2013 and obtained information from the parents, including pictures, records, and video that provided me with, at that time, sufficient information on corroborating by school performance and activities of fairly normal early development. And when the opportunity then came up to meet with them, I was planning before to go to California, and it did not work out for me. I prefer to obtain information from parents when available alive, in person, so I can observe them and interact with them while obtaining the information.
Fair to say then that in the choice between talking with them on the phone and asking them the questions and follow-up you thought important based on their answers, and relying upon the attorneys who hired you to provide you with information they thought most important, you chose the latter. Is that fair?
Yes.
And you didn't have any of that information, it sounds like, based on what you just told us, prior to your first meeting with the defendant in December of 2012, right?
Correct.
In fact, you make a note at the end of your handwritten notes for that December 19th, 2012 meeting, and we'll get into detail into that meeting, that you have things to do, and one of them is to contact the mother, father, and sister to get their perceptions of their experiences with the defendant, correct?
Correct. That's the note that we went over yesterday.
Yes. And that doesn't happen then between you and them for an additional 23 months, correct?
But video information is available to me before,
I
and
understand.
pictures of him and school records and description of the parents, to the point that based on the pictures and the description of the investigative team, I was able to identify them in a lobby of a hotel when we met without ever meeting them before. And my interactions with them and the veracity of the information they provided to the investigators was totally consistent. There was nothing surprising, not anything new in what they provided me with.
23 months later, 2 months before we started jury selection, you confirmed that, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Now, the next thing that happens here is in your report of June the 17th, 2013, when you first declared the defendant to be schizophrenic and insane, is you go through, this is what you've numbered as 3. And you'd agree that this is a pretty well organized report, right? You break out the different sections, you label them. One is records, one is background. The next you go through and list the different dates for the interviews. That's pretty well organized, don't you think?
As a neuropsychiatric evaluation report, yes.
Okay. The background that you lay out here, this is before you start to have a conversation with the defendant. Is that fair?
his background?
Well, you list number 3. I'm looking at it in your report, background. All those records and things are things you don't get from the defendant. Those are records you were provided by his attorneys, correct?
Some of the information is provided by the defendant during my interview with him. You know, I established, as I said yesterday, I established a timeline. And the timeline referred obtaining from him information that related when earlier memory that you have, when did you move, how were things at home, what you will start, a comprehensive evaluation based on the information that is provided. It is not information just provided by the defendant,
Now,
by the defense team.
Now, Doctor, I understand what you're saying. Those portions, though, of what he told you about his background, you have included specifically and with reference to him in each of the dates that you interview him in your report, correct?
Correct.
So everything under background, and I'll begin with your first sentence, the records indicate. Everything in that first section is established by the records, correct?
Yes.
Okay, that was my question. And those records were records that were provided to you by the defense team, fair?
Birth records?
No, just the, Doctor, the records that you include under
Yes.
background, correct?
Yes.
Is that yes?
Yes.
Thank you. One of the things that you do is you start to try to establish, as you said, a timeline, and that timeline really is a narrative. You'd agree with that? Is this in a narrative form, Doctor?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, what I summarize here, yes, is in a narrative form,
Yes.
yes.
Okay. And in going through those records, you lay out the things that you think are going to be relevant and helpful to explaining what mental health or psychiatric situation or changes the defendant is going through over the course of his life, correct?
Yes.
First thing that you do as you go through this, you talk about that his mother noted that he had limited verbal output at an early age, correct?
Yes.
That really doesn't change throughout the course of his life. You'd agree with that?
Not quite. I know you want me to answer with one word. It's hard for me, I think, to answer with one word.
Well, maybe the one-word answer is no, that it did change. And if that's your answer, then I'd ask you.
Yes.
Okay, tell me.
So earlier in development, one of the questions that I've asked the defense to obtain from the mother was, when did he begin to talk? And there's variability in children about language. Boys many times speak later than girls. Girls are more fluent. And commonly you expect kids to begin to talk in sentences, 2 words, 3 words, 4 words, age 2, about. There's variability again. And I wanted to know if he had some difficulty earlier on in talking, in verbalization. And the information was that he did have some difficulties, but by age 2, he was talking as expected. And the difficulties that I inquired specifically and got back information was that at times there will be just few words that he will say, and his maternal grandmother, his mother consulted with his maternal grandmother who advised her, when you are with him, why won't you point at objects around the house, and this will facilitate him learning about furniture and things like that. So by age 2, he was okay, and that was what the information that I got, and I confirmed in future interview directly.
Thank you. The next thing that you go through is you talk real briefly about a situation where he'd had some outbursts at home, correctly?
Correct.
Correct, sorry. And then the next big thing is when you reference the counseling that has to take place after they move back from Salinas or Castroville up north down to San Diego. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And that's significant because that's a big turning point as you see it in his background, correct?
Yes.
And really prior to that, there were no documented issues of him being introverted or socialization or hooked on computer games. There's nothing like that. It really begins with this move to San Diego, correct?
Correct.
That outburst thing that you talked about, let's just step back there. That's when he was 8, is that right?
Yes.
Do you remember the outburst?
Yes, that he will stay more in his room. He will disagree with his parents on things that he needed to do, and his parents thought professional help. He saw a social worker who advised his parent, or interacted with him. I believe it was in an outdoor setting that many times professionals adapt to children, and worked with the parent. There was a limited number of sessions, advised the parents of how to approach him. He was firstborn, less experienced with children, that the parents said, and it resolved, easily resolved.
Understood. The outburst that you documented later on was that you said he had barricaded himself in his room, correct?
Yes.
And you remember, too, that you were able to obtain the records from the Family Services Agency of the Monterey Peninsula where this counseling took place, right?
Yes.
They were given to you by the defense attorneys, correct?
Yes.
And you received those prior to writing your report in June of 2013, correct?
Yes.
And what the specific notes in that say has nothing to do with being barricaded in his room, correct? You recall? If you don't recall, ma'am, you can say, I don't remember.
I don't remember.
If you don't remember, we'll move on, and then if there's something else, you'll be able to add it in, I'm sure.
Okay.
What the records actually reveal is that the concerns from the parents, based on their history, was that he was nonverbal. Do you recall that?
Yes.
That he was Nintendo-oriented. Do you recall that?
Yes.
That he had poor socialization. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And that he had introversion behavior. Correct?
Yes.
These were things that existed as part of who he was even at age 8. Correct?
Yes.
And the behavior he engaged in was to throw toys. Correct?
Yes.
There's observations that the social worker makes that you noted, not in your report, but that you'll remember, where she's observing him interacting with his family on a walk to the park, correct?
Yes.
And one of the things she says is, look, he's completely mute, right? You remember that? He's mute.
I don't remember that.
That he's, his head is kind of askew or cocked to the side. Remember that?
Yes.
And that she's not sure he's paying attention, but he observes every single pedestrian and traffic signal on the way to the park. Do you remember that?
Yes.
None of that, none of it, is documented in your report of June of 2013. Do you agree?
Yes.
And they actually, at the time, through their billing records and whatever, I don't know if diagnosis is the right term, but their conclusion is he has oppositional defiant disorder. Correct?
Yes.
Now, before we get back to the psychiatric history part, you go through sort of the rest of his schooling, where he went to school, the middle school, the high school, and the fact that he ends up graduating from Riverside, and he applies to 8 graduate schools in neuroscience and was not accepted. Do you recall that?
Yes.
One of the things that's not detailed in there, and it doesn't look like you follow up with him on this, is how many of those schools did he have interviews with? Do you remember?
I remember that he had an interview at the University of Iowa, I believe, and I think he had maybe one more interview, but I'm not sure.
And Doctor, I know that because there's 2 rounds of this, you may be thinking of that second round of interviews that led him to see you. Is that fair? You may be thinking about that interview at Iowa and at CU.
Iowa was the second.
Yeah. So just so that we're clear, and I don't want to confuse you. He graduates from Riverside. Great grades, honors grad, all that, right?
Yes,
He applies to 8 graduate schools, correct?
yes,
He doesn't get into any of them, correct?
yes,
And then he spends a year living at home, correct?
yes,
He reapplies to a couple, including Iowa and CU, that second time, correct?
yes,
So are we on track now?
yes.
Okay, what I want to ask you is, that first round of interviews where he is on paper, this guy is a superstar. He applies to 8 graduate schools. Do you know how many of them granted him even an interview?
As far as I remember, none, but I'm not 100% sure.
So in your recollection, he is rejected outright off of just his application, nothing to do with his interviewing, from 8 different neuroscience graduate programs, correct?
Yes,
That's got to be a blow to the ego, correct?
it can be.
Yeah, especially for a guy who has said, this is my life's goal. I want to be a neuroscientist, correct?
Yes,
So he goes home and he lives at home, right?
yes,
And he gets into playing video games again, right?
yes,
In fact, frankly, based on all the records you've reviewed and your interviews with him, he never stops playing video games. From that first time you see him as Nintendo-oriented on paper at age 8, he's always playing video games, right?
yes,
And at home, with nothing to do after being rejected from 8 schools, he plays a lot more video games, right?
yes,
And doesn't do much else around the house, correct?
yes,
Creates tension with mom and dad, right?
yes,
Mom and dad start browbeating him into getting a job, right?
yes,
And what he does is he ends up applying to a temporary agency, right?
yes,
And that temporary agency goes out and finds him the job at the pill coating factory, correct?
correct.
All of those details that we just went through, outside of applying to 8 schools and being rejected, none of them appear in your report. Fair?
They're not detailed, but they're referenced in the report that he applied to school.
And then the
But
next...
as we noted before, my report is brief, and it was not my intention to provide every specific information. It was too voluminous.
It would have been too much effort to write a report that long. Is that right?
Not effort, it's just something that is not a standard way in providing a neuropsychiatric report
In a clinical setting.
in a clinical setting.
Okay. You knew you were writing this, though, for the courts, right? Correct?
That it might be presented in a court, yes.
Well, you knew you were presenting it to attorneys, right?
Yes,
You knew that those attorneys were going to use it in a criminal case where someone was accused of 160 plus counts of murder and attempted murder, right?
yes,
Knowing all that, though, you wrote the same report you'd have written if this guy had walked in off the street in your clinic, correct?
based on more observation, more hours of interviewing, and knowing that the information that you have described is something that I've looked at, reviewed, and is available to be presented in the court.
So the answer is yes, same clinical kind of report, just you had access to a little more information, correct? Yes?
I'll say a lot more information.
A lot more information. And that lot more information resulted in a report that you generated that was 15 pages long, correct?
I take your word for it. Yes,
Yeah, and that 15th page is really just your signature underneath a paragraph that describes who you are, correct?
yes,
The first couple pages are just a listing of records you've reviewed, and you start to get into some of the background, correct?
yes,
And in terms of the actual report writing based on the interviews you did with the defendant, that makes up, I don't know, 35, 40% of the report. Is that fair?
about, yes,
Now, one of the things you did when you went through this timeline that you made is you put into your report that he got through undergraduate school with pretty much A's and A pluses for his grades. Do you remember that?
Yes,
And you know that because you went through his transcript, correct? And you saw
correct.
that. And in going through his transcript, one of the things that you saw was that right before he graduates, he gets an A in a class called Ethics and the Meaning of Life. You remember that?
Yes,
And Ethics and the Meaning of Life, and by the way, records that are contained in the discovery here, which, and by the way, am I wrong when you said you reviewed about 100,000 pages worth of stuff? That you?
lots of stuff, yes.
One of the things that's in there is the syllabus from that class. Do you recall that?
I do not remember the syllabus from that class.
So not remembering the syllabus probably means what you didn't do was look to see what the philosophers and the writings he was required to read and master to get an A. So you didn't consider that, right?
No, I knew that there were readings that had to be done to the class, but I cannot recite the readings for you.
Right, and you didn't go into the details of them to see specifically, is what he's studying right before he graduates, what he's mastered with an A, is that consistent with what he wrote in the notebook? You didn't check that, did you?
I know that in the notebook, some of the philosophical statements and his writing are based upon his reading. We did discuss his past reading that related to philosophy and that are based on it, but I did not go back and check page by page how does this writing relate to the syllabus or to his academic writing. I did not.
Doctor, that conversation that you've just testified to, that we haven't heard you testify to on direct exam, the one where you asked him about the books that he was reading that helped him generate these philosophical writings in his notebook. You didn't have that conversation with him before June of 2013 when you opined that he was schizophrenic and insane, did you?
Not in detail, that followed later.
When you say not in detail, can you point to me anywhere in your notes or report where you even reference it in general that you had that conversation with him?
I think that on the notebook that I began, to see, that I began to go over with him on May 2nd visit. What I did first is go over the notebook in general and asking him about his philosophical approaches. But if you ask me, did I write down every answer or every question that I asked, the answer is no, I did not.
Well, and you didn't even write down that subject matter in your notes or in your report, correct?
Correct.
So what we're hearing is you are remembering today, July the 8th, 2015, a conversation that you purported to have with him on May 2nd, 2013. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. One of the other things that you indicated in your report that you seem to emphasize as significant was that the defendant, and this is before you talked to him, this is in the background part, that he performed below expectations in his graduate level work. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And when you say below expectations, you are talking about in the abstract just on paper, aren't you?
May I ask you to clarify, please?
Yeah, when you say he performed below expectations, here's why I'm asking that. We had a bunch of professors from that neuroscience program come up here and tell us it's just not that unusual for people who are great students on paper in undergrad to come here and not succeed. You don't disagree that that's true not just in neuroscience, but in everything, right?
I agree, and I said that yesterday in my testimony.
I understand. But in your report, what you said is he performed below expectations, right?
Correct.
You also then have quotes in this section that are not attributed to any specific individual. And I'll point you to them. You said Mr. Holmes was described as disorganized in his answers, seemed to wander around. He didn't give clear answers, was trying to answer but not being clear. Who said that?
Can you please let me know what page are you on?
Oh, ma'am, I've kind of cut and pasted it from your report. It should be under that background part, and
But
which
I remember the words, so it's
okay.
okay. I
Okay,
remember the
thank you.
words. So this was information that was obtained, two points. One was from his description of his difficulties in graduate school, and by the defense team interviewing people who knew him and people who were part of the lab in graduate school.
So, and to be clear though, it wasn't important for your purpose, and that may be the case, to indicate who said that about him, whether it was a fellow student, a professor, a friend, a girlfriend. It's just a quote you throw in there. Mr. Holmes was described as, correct?
Correct. I did not put a specific name. I think that these are probably available in the information that was obtained and might be available to you too.
We may just not have heard from those particular witnesses in this case, right?
Possibly.
Now, the other thing that you said in here is that he did not do well uniformly, not specific to a section. Do you recall that?
I do not remember that, and I will have to look at the context of the report. I do not remember these words.
I think it's in that background part there. It might be part of that same paragraph. Yeah.
Yeah, I see it. I
Okay.
see it under, yes, I see
Okay,
it.
so you described him as not doing well uniformly. Do you recall that?
Yes,
Truth is, guy did well in almost all the classes that required just writing, didn't he?
yeah, he got good grades.
Yeah, got good grades in grad school. So when you say he did not do well uniformly, that's not really borne out by his performance throughout both semesters of grad school, correct?
Yes and no.
Well, what's the no part? Where is it uniformly he didn't do well?
The no part, the no part is his expectations from himself. He considered his performance to be below what he wished to perform and excel in graduate school. His perception that was not, as I said yesterday, was not consistent with the grades and the perception of his professors. He might have had some difficulties in a laboratory in performance requiring going over the procedures, which can happen in graduate school. His perception was that he is a failure. That's the irrational part about him.
Doctor, that statement that we just agreed that you made, he did not do well uniformly, not specific to a section. That is contained in a paragraph that is not from the defendant. It is about the defendant from information you were provided by defense attorneys, correct?
From information from him.
In that section?
From interviewing him, yes.
You don't put quotes around anything in there, nor do you use the phrase, Mr. Holmes told me he did not do well uniformly. Do you agree with that?
Correct. These are not his words. It's my summary of the words that follow up later.
In the background section before you ever sit down to talk with him, correct?
The background section was written after I interviewed him several times. So part of the background information is the information I obtained from Mr. Holmes. It's multiple sources. It's school records, interviews of students and lab directors who worked with him, and information obtained from him, all the information that I could obtain.
Doctor, I think we've sort of missed something about that quote. There actually is quotes around that sentence, he did not do well uniformly, not specific to a section. Do you see that? There's an end quote there, right after not specific to a section. You put it in there. Do you see it?
Yeah, I see it. It started, it didn't give
Right.
clear answers. Yes.
So let's read the whole quote.
Okay?
He didn't give clear answers, was trying to answer, comma, but not being clear, gave much less detail than should have been given. Answers were not coming out. He did not do well uniformly, not specific to a section, end quote. You agree?
Yes.
That did not come from the defendant, right?
I do not remember if these were his words that I put in or words of other people.
You think that this quote where he could be describing himself in the third person, he didn't give clear answers, he could have been talking about himself?
Possibly, yes.
Is there any time, anywhere, on any piece of paper, report, or otherwise, you indicate the defendant refers to himself in the third person?
No, but I refer to him as he.
But you put the he in the quotes, right? Like someone else is describing the defendant. Correct?
I mean, for the grammatics in English, it might be that this is the case. It is not my first language, and sometimes I just might make a mistake in how I write, and for this I apologize. But I do stand that this information was obtained both from the defendant and from other people who were interviewed by the defense. It doesn't take away from the veracity of the information.
Understood.
Maybe I didn't use the quotes properly, for which I apologize.
Well, that may be a different issue. We'll get to the quotes part in a minute. But to be clear, nowhere in any report do you attribute this statement or even these kinds of words to the defendant. Agreed?
Yes.
In fact, it is equally plausible that this was a statement or a quote given to you by the defense attorneys that you adopted and put in your report, right?
Possible that it was in the information of the interviews that they have conducted with his peers and instructors in graduate school.
Okay. Then there's a section under social history that again has a number of quotes in it, but they're not attributed to any individual. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
You don't document who said them or what their relationship was to the defendant or how it is they may even know this, right?
Correct.
You then talk about, briefly in this social history, you indicate that he was asked out on a date in October of 2011. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Is it significant who asked whom out or who initiated that relationship?
Not necessarily. At times, females will be more straightforward and ask a male for a date. And at times, maybe more common is that a male will ask a female for a date. But there are females who ask for a date.
But in this particular situation, we're talking about a guy who has had introversion issues and socialization issues starting at age 8. You'd agree, right? Yes?
Well, I think that the degree, if I may answer in more words, I think that the degree, there is always a process, a developmental process that can be signs before that a child is shy and not seeking out interactions with others, but the child is within normal limits. There are many children who are more shy. It is becoming more noticeable, is what I try to document, is after the transition to San Diego. So to put it at age 8, they sought professional help, and this was observed, but it did not seem to have such a marked impact on his life at this young age.
And I get what you're trying to add in there, but let me just be clear for the record.
Yeah.
These weren't just things that were observed. The statements about Nintendo-oriented, poor socialization per mother and father, and the introversion issues, or I'm sorry, introvertive behavior, were all things that his parents told the social worker when he was age 8, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So in this case, though, we're not talking about a guy who's like any other guy, boys ask out girls, girls ask out boys. We're not talking about that, right? Correct?
Partly, yeah.
Well,
I mean,
and again, in part because you described him as being somewhat of a loner even in undergrad, right?
yes,
Okay. So in this particular case, though, what you remember is the defendant reaches out to Miss Dada through a CU email. Do you remember that? To get her phone number? Does that help?
that's in his undergraduate.
No, ma'am.
No, you're talking about graduate school?
The only girlfriend he's ever had in his life.
To Gargi.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
So you recall that he reaches out to her by email to get her phone number, correct?
Yes.
And do you remember the clever little thing that he put in the email to get that?
I don't remember.
Do you remember something along the lines of, hey girl, I lost my phone number, can I get yours?
Yes.
Yeah, that's kind of clever, isn't it?
Yeah.
Then you say, and there's not a lot more of a discussion here, you describe it as he was asked on a date and had his first and only girlfriend. She stopped the relationship, and then you move on to other stuff. Do you see that?
Yes.
Okay. And then you highlight in there, you say by early April 2012, he cut off almost all relationships with other graduate students and became increasingly isolated, right?
Yes.
And you thought that that was significant.
Yes.
One of the things, though, that is not referenced in here are his efforts to initiate a dating relationship with another woman from his graduate school program, right?
Hillary?
Correct.
Yes.
And not only is it not documented here in your June 2013 report declaring him schizophrenic and insane, it's not documented in any report that you generated, is it?
Correct. I did not document all email exchanges and interactions with people in the graduate program.
This is a relationship that he initiated in late or in mid-April, correct?
Correct.
And continued on, including texting conversations back and forth through early July, right?
Yes.
And it appears nowhere in any report or any notes that you generated. Is that fair?
Yes.
So when Mr. King approached yesterday, Your Honor, may I approach?
Yes.
And got you to say, yep, I looked at these texts and I considered these texts and I thought this language was significant. Do you remember all that?
Yes.
And I'm talking about People's 1046. Whatever significance it had wasn't a big enough deal to put in any reports that you thought judges, attorneys, or a jury might review. Fair? Fair?
In my report?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. It's not in there, right?
No.
We'll get to some other stuff that he did regarding his attempts at socialization as he leads up to the shooting here in a bit. But I want to keep going through the flow of your report here, this initial report declaring him insane. You go through, now we're in the psychiatric history again. Remember that?
Yes.
We've already covered age 8, right?
Yes.
And in fact, this is the section under psychiatric history where you write temper tantrums and barricading himself in his room, correct?
Yes.
And because those were not contained in the actual reports from the Family Services Center, you had to have gotten them from either the defendant or his attorneys, correct?
Yes.
One of the things that was important to document was that this suicidal gesture of scratching his wrist with cardboard. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Now, that is not documented in any medical records that you were provided prior to meeting with the defendant. Fair?
Correct.
And the parents certainly didn't know anything about this, right?
Yes.
Because the defendant only did it in the van, yes?
Yes.
Where no one could see it, correct?
Yes.
In a manner where it couldn't really cause any damage, correct?
Yes.
And so that it wouldn't be visible to others, right?
Yes.
And then he kept it from everyone else around him, right?
Yes.
So that suicidal gesture could not have been the precipitating factor for him going to see Mel Lipsy after they moved to San Diego, right?
Yes.
You were told by the defense that the parents had observed this suicidal gesture.
Objection calls for hearsay.
Why don't you rephrase your question?
Ma'am, you were provided information by the defense from whatever source that you considered in your expert evaluation here that his parents actually did know about the suicidal gesture, right?
No.
You were never told that. Is that right? Is that true?
Yeah.
We're never told that.
Yeah, in the paragraph on page 3, when the family moved back to San Diego, the parents were concerned about his increased isolation, lack of interaction with other children, and the suicidal gesture of scratching his wrist.
So it sounds like the parents knew about the suicidal gesture.
The parents did not know about it.
So when you write the parents were concerned about isolation, interactions, and the suicidal gesture, how could they have been concerned about it and not have known about it?
No, so it's out of place.
It's not accurate.
It's not accurate. They did not know about that.
Okay. Okay. So they ended up going to see Mel Lipsy then just for, it looks like, unless there's something else inaccurate about this, just about their concern about his isolation and lack of interactions, right?
Correct.
We'll get to another possible reason for that, but I want to get back to the suicidal gesture. Do you remember that the suicidal gesture that you've described that he made that was unknown to his parents, that it was because he did not want to move back to San Diego, right?
Yes.
He had friends up north, correct?
Yes.
He did not, and we already know social anxiety, big deal for this guy, right? Is that true?
Big deal.
Yeah,
at
a
that
big
time,
impact on his life.
Before departure, yes.
Yeah. So that's why he tried to make that suicidal gesture as you've described it with the cardboard, correct?
Yes.
Something else you put later on in your report that you said the defendant told you was that he did it because his parents told him not to speak. Do you recall that?
Yes.
That's not in this section, is it?
No, it's not in this section. It's in another section.
And being told not to speak feels different than I just didn't want to move because of my friends, right? Correct?
It's one component. There are multiple components to he didn't want to move. There are multiple components for him being upset. One is the move, and one is his explanation that his parents don't want him to talk.
So when a guy tells you, when the defendant tells you at some point, any point, whether it's now or 2 months before we start jury selection, that part of the reason he made this first and only suicidal gesture in his life at this pivotal point, that he did it because people told him not to talk, you want to look into what that means, right? Correct?
Yeah.
Okay. You never asked the parents what that meant, did you?
I did talk to them about, they did not remember that they asked him not to talk. I did go over it with them when I met them later on.
So they don't know what he was talking about, right?
Correct.
And what your report and your notes reveal too is that you did no follow-up with the defendant himself about what it meant people told him not to speak. You don't have any explanation for that anywhere in your notes or your report.
I did talk to him about it, and my understanding of it, my clinical interpretation of it, is that he was justifying at multiple levels the difficulty that he was having. And rather than say, I have difficulties at that time of talking to people, initiating, interacting with others, is that I'm told not to talk. That's why I am so different. Not a logical explanation, but that's what was my conclusion.
The other stuff, though, your clinical impressions and interpretation, none of that found its way into your notes or your reports. Fair?
Yes.
Okay. So we're hearing that for the first time right here today on July 8th, correct?
No, but I wrote it down that he told him not to talk.
But just that, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Now, one of the things about going to see Mel Lipsy, it was because of this socialization issue and, I'm sorry, there was one other thing I left out. Socialization and, what was the other thing? Can't remember.
And lack of interaction with other children.
That's it. One of the things that was not a precipitating factor was information that was revealed to you that he had backhanded his sister or been violent with her in any way, right?
No, he had difficulties with his sister
No.
at home.
Doctor, what I'm asking you is, you don't have any described connection, or in fact, you don't ever say that he was physically violent with his sister in here, right?
Correct.
And you don't associate him backhanding his sister with the parents' decision to take him to see Mel Lipsy as part of family therapy, right?
Not at that time.
Right. The reason I ask this is there's a guy named Dr. Jonathan Woodcock. Have you heard that name before?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And prior to meeting with the defendant, December, February, and May, and then writing a report opining that the defendant was insane and schizophrenic, did you have Dr. Woodcock's notes?
I did see his notes, but I'm not sure what was the date that I got them. I can check it.
Do you think it's possible that the defense did not give you Jonathan Woodcock's notes until after you had opined that the defendant was insane?
Objection. The counsel's making us a witness.
Go ahead, doctor.
Yeah, I don't remember when I got Dr. Woodcock's notes.
Now, and we'll get into some more of the things that was told to him, but he has a pretty unique vantage point of the defendant, doesn't he?
I'm not sure what you refer to.
And I'll clarify that.
Okay.
He is a psychiatrist, right?
Yes.
And he's actually a board-certified psychiatrist, right?
Yes.
And he saw the defendant in jail 4 days after he went into that theater to kill all those people, right?
Yes.
So his notes and his observations would be something you would want to have if you're going to try to evaluate what was going on in the defendant's head 4 days earlier, right?
Yes.
You don't have any notes or any documentation anywhere before you opine that the defendant is schizophrenic insane about a single thing that Dr. Jonathan Woodcock did or got from the defendant. Is that fair?
I knew that Dr. Woodcock interviewed the defendant for about 3 hours and thought that he was psychotic, mentally ill and psychotic, but I do not remember when did I get his notes. But I did know that he did interview him, and this was the diagnosis.
Did you know that he
considered.
I'm sorry, doctor. I'm sorry. Did you know that he'd interviewed him before you opined that he was schizophrenic and insane?
Yes.
Okay, so knowing that he interviewed him, one of the things that would have been critical to you is to have a conversation with Dr. Woodcock, right?
Yes.
You did not do that.
I tried.
You did not have a conversation with
I
Dr.
did not
Woodcock.
have a conversation.
And we've heard he's not good at returning calls. Is that what happened?
I did not get a call, correct.
There's also 14 pages of notes that you must have been aware he had taken some notes from this meeting, right?
Yes.
And before you issued a report opining to the attorneys and to the court that this guy was insane and schizophrenic, you must have insisted on seeing those pivotal notes from 4 days after the crime, right?
And I'm not sure that I did not see them. I said I do not remember when I had the notes.
And
so this is something that I can check into.
Yeah, well, and part of it, though, is because it's not documented anywhere in your report, right?
Well, in the background information, it does say that I've reviewed medical, psychiatric, other institutional records and relevant portion of the discovery material related to Dr. Holmes. And it might be related to Mr. Holmes that have been created. I believe this was part of it, but I do not enumerate, as we have gone through before, all the records and day by day that I've seen that maybe is the standard of a forensic report, but not of a neuropsychiatric report.
But to be clear,
me.
one of the things that you do, doctor, is to make sure that, and I'm sorry I said do, but that you do engage in, is to put in your reports those things that you believe are significant and important to your conclusions and evaluation, right?
Yes,
And not a single word or reference to Dr. Woodcock appears anywhere in that June 2013 report. Fair?
yes.
And the reason that's important, doctor, is because, and you've probably had a chance now to review those records, is because the defendant tells Dr. Woodcock on July the 24th that the reason they had to go to family therapy was because his parents were concerned when he backhanded his sister. Do you recall that?
Yes.
That is inconsistent with the statements he made to you about why they went to see Mel Lipsy, correct?
I knew that he had difficulties at home with his sister, and it was provided by him. I did not include it in putting it down at the report.
And doctor, what we can conclude then is that you certainly didn't talk to the defendant at all about any physically aggressive anythings that the defendant did with his sister as a predicate to going to see Mel Lipsy, right?
Not as a predicate of going to see Lipsy, but in covering his relationship at home with his mother, his father, and his sister. He had no relationship, a good relationship with his sister.
You know, I understand. I see that in your report, but nowhere in your June 2013 report opining on schizophrenia and insanity do you go into anything with the defendant about physically striking his sister. Fair?
Yes.
And nowhere in that report does it indicate that the reason they went to go see Mel Lipsy had anything to do with acts of physical confrontation between the defendant and his sister, right?
As a third component to the social isolation and the other points that you went through.
Yeah, I understand. Then we go through some more of the details of the psychiatric history
Yes.
that you think are relevant enough to include. Fair?
Yes.
One of the things that you include in there is a reference to his trips to see Miss Roth, Dr. Fenton, and Dr. Feinstein, correct?
Yes.
And you type in not all of the notes that they generated, but just some notes that you thought were most relevant, correct?
Yes.
One of the things that you did not do prior to opining on sanity and schizophrenia was you did not pick up the phone and speak with Miss Roth, correct?
I did not, and my understanding from the defense was that they are not available to talk to us, all of the people, all of the professionals who have seen him, that this is not an avenue that I can pursue.
Understood. That means too then, my guess is you didn't reach out to Drs. Fenton or Feinstein.
On legal advice.
Right.
I mean,
Understood.
I cannot just pick up the phone and call people.
I get that.
Objection, may we approach?
Yes. All right, you may proceed.
Doctor, one of the things you indicated in the section where you start to go through some of the notes that Ms. Roth indicated here was you end up at some point saying that the defendant went to go see Ms. Roth and Dr. Fenton and Dr. Feinstein to rid himself of his homicidal thoughts. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Again, back to Dr. Woodcock's notes. You recall from Dr. Woodcock's notes 4 days after this shooting what the defendant told Dr. Woodcock about that.
Related to anxiety?
No, related to why he sought treatment and his thoughts about the homicidal ideation. Do you recall that?
I don't remember. I remember he spoke to him, but I don't remember the words he told him.
You remember in the notes that the defendant says, I didn't really consider them a problem.
Yes.
That statement did not make it into your report. Fair? Is that fair?
It is not in my report.
One of the things that I just want to make sure that I'm clear because someone told me they didn't think it was clear, was that he did not consider his homicidal ideations a problem when he spoke about them to Dr. Woodcock 4 days later pursuant to his notes, correct?
He did not disclose to Dr. Woodcock that this was a problem.
It's more than that, actually. Doctor, do you remember in the notes, he actually is asked by Dr. Woodcock, and Dr. Woodcock asks him, and the defendant says, I didn't consider them a problem. You remember that?
Yeah, that's what he reported.
Okay. One of the other things that is not indicated in the notes here, oh, I'm sorry, it is indicated in the notes, but it's important, is that he denies any suicidal ideation to Ms. Roth, correct?
Correct.
And it's your understanding that throughout the course of whatever treatment he allows himself to go through with Dr. Fenton and Feinstein, he denies suicidal ideation every single time, correct?
Yes.
In fact, what he tells them when they ask about his past history of suicide or suicidal ideation, he denies that too, correct?
Yes.
He also denies being depressed, correct?
Yes.
Start to stop from March through June, fair?
Yes.
And he's never observed by any of them to be depressed, correct?
It's not in the notes.
Well, yeah, and in fact, they say he doesn't seem depressed in their notes, right?
Yes.
So it is in their notes, right?
I'm sorry, what I meant is that it's not in their note that he is depressed. They do not see depression.
Correct. They noted that he did
He's
not
not
seem
depressed.
depressed to them.
Yes, correct.
One of the things that you indicate in here are that he is on a certain amount of medications, right? Correct?
Yes.
One of the things that I don't see at any time in your interviews with him before you opine that he's insane and schizophrenic in June of 2013 is a conversation you had with the defendant where you asked him why he stopped taking his medications in May. You recall that? Did you ask him anything like that?
Yeah.
You did?
I discussed it with him.
You discussed him discontinuing on his own his medications in May of 2012?
Yeah.
Where is that?
It's not, as you know, as I said before, my report does not include every word that I exchanged with Mr. Holmes. It was difficult to conduct the interview. It was important for me to obtain as much information as I could and pay attention to him and encourage him to talk more. But I did go over with him his student health experience, the medication, the effect of the medication on him, and discontinuing treatment on his own. Treatment was available to him, as we discussed, and with that, discontinuation of the medication. He discontinued treatment.
Right. He discontinued treatment after the June 11th appointment with Drs. Fenton and Feinstein, correct?
Correct.
But he discontinued taking his medications as early as May. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Okay. And again, it's not in here because you didn't think that decision by him to discontinue his medications was significant to be considered with your opinion about his sanity or his potential schizophrenia. Is that fair?
I thought that in the total picture, based on all the information, is discontinuing the medication was not something surprising. Most people, many people do that, as you were mentioning yesterday yourself. 50% of people with schizophrenia go off and on the medication. This is common, lack of adherence, well documented in the literature. So I did not think that this was the most important part leading to what happened on July 20th.
So that we're clear, even though you think it's consistent with schizophrenics, as you've just told us now, it wasn't important enough to document in the report.
I did not consider that I need to document it in the report.
And in fact,
when asked, I'm telling you.
Thank you. And in the absence of the notes and the reports, you're actually recalling that for the first time here on July 8th from a conversation you had perhaps more than 2 years ago, right?
Yes, but it is a standard of conducting an evaluation that relates to the care provided, the medication. Did you stop? Why did you stop? It's so.
See, here's why I'm asking, is that you go through details of the medications he's prescribed in several paragraphs in your report. You agree with that, right?
Yes.
Because it was important to detail the medications he was on, correct?
Yes.
And you even detail the dates that those prescriptions were made, correct?
Yes.
But what you're telling us here today is it was not significant enough to document that he chose to discontinue them in May before he discontinued his treatment with Drs. Fenton and Feinstein.
Objection, misstates the evidence.
Overruled.
Go ahead, doctor.
So I did not document it in my report.
Okay. Now, in your, you go through this analysis then, paragraphs of stuff that takes place with Ms. Roth, Drs. Fenton, and Drs. Feinstein, and you get all the way up to that last meeting in June of 2012 in your report. You agree with that, right?
Yes.
And then the next thing you write about in the psychiatric history are the events in November of 2012. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
And in between there was that pivotal 2 hours and 45-minute interview with Dr. Woodcock 4 days after the shooting, right?
Yes.
That is a visit by a psychiatrist, correct?
Yes.
Where he is taking in part some psychiatric history, right?
Yes.
Even though he told us he wasn't allowed to talk about the crime or any of the planning for it. You remember that?
Yes.
That appears nowhere in your psychiatric history delineation in your report, correct?
Correct.
Now, there's only a couple reasons that could be, and I want you to tell me which one it is. One, I didn't have the information at the time, otherwise I'd have put it in there. Or, I read through it, I saw it, didn't think it was that big a deal, and that's why I didn't put it in there. Which one?
I don't remember if it was the first, if I did have the report before, and I can check.
So that, I guess that explains then, you'd agree, why in your report and in your interviews you never discuss with the defendant anything about plans A, B, or C, right? Do you even know what I'm talking about?
I know what you're talking about, and I did go over it with him later about his plans.
I get it, but I'm talking about plans A, B, or C. You don't go through those with him before you opine that he's schizophrenic and insane of June of 2013, right?
Not in the order of plan A, B, or C, but focusing on his state of mind and the alternative that he considered before that.
And you don't put in anywhere in here the statements that he made to Dr. Woodcock about not wanting what he did to happen to himself, right?
Yeah, I did not include Dr. Woodcock.
or the statements that the defendant purportedly made to him, correct?
Yes.
Also, in your delineation of what took place in jail, you put down the things that we've heard about recently about the him jumping off the bed and running into the wall, those kinds of things. You agree you put those in there, right?
Yes.
But from the records, what you know is he did some other things too, like he tried to dismantle a handicap bar to make a club. Do you recall that?
Yes.
That isn't in your report, right?
It's not.
He tries to dismantle an electrical plate on a wall, correct?
Yes.
Not in your report.
Yes.
There's a video, and my guess is you didn't see it at this time, but there's a video that showed up later where he is trying to get out of his chains that keep him in a cell prior to court. Did you see that video?
I'm trying to remember. I saw the video where he's jumping at the wall and some of his bizarre behavior and trying to look through the door. And it might be, I don't remember.
Okay. And then you go through, when you finish going through that stuff, you then go to examinations. And that's something you have organized in your report as number 4, examinations. Do you see that?
Yes.
And one of the things that's important that you document in there before you get into the actual visits with him are that he is on a stable dose of risperidone, Lexapro, and Cogentin.
Yes.
Okay. And frankly, those are the meds he ends up being on pretty consistently from the first time you saw him till, as far as we know today, right?
Yes.
And certainly the same meds he was on then when he met with doctors Reed and Metzner, correct?
Yes.
All right, let's get to these visits, because in these visits, and there's 4 of them that you document here before you opine that he's insane, there are specific quotes that you attribute to the defendant, right?
Yes.
Now, there are things that you say that he says that aren't in quotes, and those we should treat differently, correct?
I'm not sure that should be treated. I put in quotes specific words.
Okay.
And it was a summary of the content of what he conveyed to me.
I want to make sure I know how important the quotes are. If you put quotes around it, we can take it to the bank that those are the words he said and the way that he said them, right?
Correct.
Now, in this first conversation you have with him on December 19th, 2012, you start to re-go through the background that you had indicated on an earlier page with him to get his input on it. Fair?
Yes.
And one of the things that you discuss is that when he gets to graduate school, he decides he wants to socialize more, correct?
That's what he said, yes.
And he attributes part of his not performing as well as he might have liked to the fact that he really wanted to socialize more, correct?
Correct.
And that helps explain his efforts at reaching out to Miss Dada to get her phone number, right?
Yes.
He ends up developing a core group of friends. Do you remember that?
Yes.
One of those is a guy named Ben Garcia. Fair?
Yes.
Did you reach out to Miss Dada or Mr. Garcia?
I don't believe they were available to me.
Okay. But you made efforts to get a hold of them?
Judge, same objection as before.
Sustained.
So to explain, I did not...
Hold on. Doctor, there's not a question.
Okay.
Go ahead. Ask your next question, please.
You did talk about his girlfriend with him, correct?
Yes.
But really all you asked about was if he'd had a girlfriend and when they separated, correct?
That's what a brief outline in the report. I spoke to him more about it. I spoke to him about did they have an intimate relationship? What did they do together? How did it go from his perspective? How did he think it went from her perspective?
Okay, and none of that's in your report. Fair?
In my report, it is not a transcript of every word over the hours that has taken place.
No, but it is a delineation of important facts to you in assessing the mental health of the defendant, correct?
Yes,
And one of the things that you do not put in your report is that more than just being his first girlfriend, that the defendant's first sexual experience in his life was with this woman, correct?
correct.
And that he was in love with her, correct?
He
Correct.
was.
And that she broke up with him.
Yes,
The other thing that you don't do with him or at all before you opine that he is insane or schizophrenic is go through with him the Gmail chats that he had with her over the course of their relationship.
I did go discuss with him the Gmail chats that he had with her, and it's briefly in my, I believe, May 2nd.
We'll get there. Now there's another part where you start to talk to him about the thoughts that he has, and you indicate that he says he tried, and you put in quotes, blocking the thoughts of hurting himself. Do you see that?
I don't see it, but I know I did it.
Okay.
I wrote it down.
And when you put it in quotes, it means that he was blocking.
He was blocking, correct.
And he used that word blocking, correct?
Yes,
Now, you know from a review of all the other records and all the conversations that he's had with mental health professionals that were documented, his girlfriend, anyone that we have records of, he'd never used the word blocking before he talked with you on December the 19th, 2012, correct?
yes.
Mr. Brockler,
Yes, Judge.
one of the jurors needs a break.
Yes, sir.
So we're going to go ahead and take our morning break. All right, members of the jury, please make sure that you comply with all the admonishments I have been giving you throughout the trial. Let's take our morning break. I'll see you back here in about 20 minutes. Thank you. Please be seated, everyone. The record should reflect that we're outside the presence of the jury. Is there anything we need to talk about at this time?
No, Your Honor.
Okay, I'll see you after the break. Thank you.